Did you ever DNA test Baron Trump? The liberal TV host smirked, thinking he had just delivered the ultimate gotcha moment. But within seconds, the room fell silent. Melania Trump had already seen this trap coming. What she did next shattered the host's plan and left the audience gasping. What secret had she uncovered? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The studio buzzed with restless anticipation, a quiet hum of tension crackling beneath the bright glow of the stage lights. The evening show was moments away from going live, and the audience, a carefully curated mix of political enthusiasts and late-night television loyalists, whispered among themselves, eager to witness what was being hyped as an unfiltered conversation with Melania Trump. But the audience didn't know the full truth. Seated in front of the mirror in his private dressing room, the host, a well-known liberal media personality, smirked as he adjusted his tie. He had crafted a trap. A question so loaded, so sensational, that it would either force Melania into an awkward stumble or ignite a media firestorm that would dominate headlines for weeks. He relished the thought of it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. His chance to humiliate the former First Lady in a way no one else had dared. His show had seen declining ratings in recent months, and tonight was his big opportunity to shift the tide. In his hands, he held a sleek cue card, but written on it was a single, explosive question that he would reveal at the perfect moment. A question meant not just to rattle Melania, but to make the world doubt everything about her family. Did you ever DNA test Baron Trump? The words were simple, yet their implication was vicious. They suggested doubt, scandal, and humiliation, designed to make Melania squirm under the weight of national scrutiny. Even the most graceful people cracked when forced to defend their family against cruel speculation. He envisioned the headlines: Melania Trump stunned by paternity question live on air. His career was about to skyrocket. As the final countdown began, the studio staff scurried into position. The producer gave him a thumbs up from the control room. A hidden smirk curled the corners of his lips as he took his seat across from the guest of the evening. Melania Trump sat poised, her expression unreadable, a picture of elegance and quiet power. The former First Lady exuded an air of unshaken composure, her eyes calm and unwavering as she waited for the show to begin. She had faced countless media attacks over the years, had been underestimated and misrepresented in every way imaginable, yet she never allowed the press to define her. And tonight, though she did not yet know what was coming, she was prepared. Far more than the host realized. A red light blinked on. The cameras began rolling. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's special broadcast. The host's voice rang out, polished and confident. The audience erupted into applause, the orchestrated energy of the moment filling the room as the host leaned forward, flashing a well-practiced smile. We are honored to have with us tonight a woman who has stood beside one of the most controversial figures in modern history, a former First Lady, businesswoman, and mother, Melania Trump. More applause. The studio's atmosphere shimmered with a mix of excitement and tension. Every movement was calculated. Every word weighed in anticipation of what was about to unfold. Melania nodded slightly, offering a polite yet reserved smile. She sensed something was off, but she would play the game, for now. The host began with harmless, introductory questions. Light conversation about her life post-White House, her philanthropic efforts, and her views on the current political climate. It was all a setup, a clever misdirection to lull her into a false sense of control before he struck. Then, after what seemed like casual discussion, the host took a deep breath, leaned forward, and with a deliberate pause, lowered his voice for dramatic effect. He turned to the camera, his tone feigning sympathy and concern. "You know," he said smoothly, lifting a single cue card, "we received thousands of viewer-submitted questions for tonight's interview." A murmur spread across the audience, some leaning forward in their seats. Melania blinked but remained still. She could feel the trap tightening. And after much careful consideration, the host continued, allowing just the right amount of tension to build, there was one question that truly stood out. The pause was excruciating. Melania's gaze didn't waver. The audience sat in suspense, waiting for the reveal. Then, with a calculated smirk, the host finally dropped the bombshell. Did you ever DNA test Baron Trump? The room fell deathly silent. A sharp, collective gasp rippled through the audience, followed by the buzz of uneasy whispers. The implication of the question hung in the air like a thick cloud of smoke, curling through the stunned crowd. It wasn't just an invasion of Melania's privacy. It was an attack on her son, a deliberate character assassination cloaked under the disguise of a viewer question. The camera immediately cut to Melania, zooming in on her expression. The host's plan was simple: force a reaction, make her stumble, catch a flicker of shock or rage, and turn it into the viral moment of the year. But something was wrong. The reaction he expected never came. Instead of shock, anger, or embarrassment, Melania Trump sat in absolute stillness, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that shattered his smug confidence. The audience wasn't prepared for what happened next, because as the host leaned back, basking in what he believed was his moment of triumph, he failed to notice the one thing that Melania had already caught. A woman in the back row gripping a manila folder, trembling. The real story had just begun. A palpable tension settled over the studio like a suffocating fog. The audience, once buzzing with excitement, now sat frozen, eyes darting between Melania Trump and the smirking host. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that made people lean forward in their seats, waiting for the fallout. But what they didn't realize, what the host had failed to predict, was that this moment would not go the way he had planned. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Did you ever DNA test Baron Trump? The host's smirk widened just a fraction. This was it, the moment he'd orchestrated, where the First Lady would either lose her composure or be forced into an uncomfortable denial. Either way, he'd won. Except he hadn't. Melania did not blink. She did not flinch. Instead, she turned her head slightly, her eyes shifting past the host, past the cameras, and into the audience. She had seen something he had not. A woman in the back row. Her hands gripped a manila folder, knuckles white, lips pressed together in a trembling line. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, darting frantically between Melania and the host, as if trying to stop something before it was too late. For the first time that night, the host faltered. He followed Melania's gaze, turning to see what had suddenly become more important than his planned scandal. And then the unexpected happened. Before he could regain control, before he could pivot the moment back in his favor, Melania spoke. "I'd like to speak directly to the person who asked this question." Her voice was calm, steady, but carried a weight that silenced the entire room. The host's smirk slipped. "Oh, I don't think we need to," he started, scrambling to maintain dominance. But Melania was already standing. And when Melania Trump stands, the world watches. A hush fell over the studio. The audience, the crew, even the host, sensed the shift in power. This was no longer his show. This was her moment now. With poise and deliberate grace, she turned away from the host and faced the woman in the back row. And then the real bombshell dropped. "Because I know why she really asked about genetic testing." A gasp erupted from the crowd. All eyes snapped to the woman clutching the manila folder, her body shaking as silent tears spilled down her cheeks. The host, caught completely off guard, stammered, what are you—" But it was too late. The woman in the audience stood. Her voice cracked, raw and desperate. "I'm sorry." Her small, trembling voice sent shockwaves through the room. "I didn't mean it like that at all." The host's face drained of color. He had miscalculated. Badly. This was not what he had expected. The audience watched in stunned silence as the woman clutched the manila folder to her chest, as though it were the last thing holding her together. Then, in a voice thick with emotion, she revealed the truth. "My son Tommy is 14 years old, and already 6'4". A murmur rippled through the audience. He's growing too fast, too much too soon. The doctors, they want all these expensive genetic tests. She held up the folder. Medical bills spilled onto the floor. Papers fluttered, landing at her feet. Bills, debt, desperation. The truth hit like a tidal wave. She wasn't asking about Baron Trump for gossip. She was pleading for help. Her voice broke as she continued. I work 3 jobs. I've sold my car. I've done everything I can, but it's not enough. I didn't mean any harm. I just needed to know if someone else had been through this, if anyone understood. The audience was stunned. The host was speechless. The trap he had set for Melania had suddenly become his own undoing. And Melania? She was not surprised. In fact, she had been expecting this, because as the host floundered, searching for a way to reclaim control, Melania reached into her own folder, holding it up for the cameras to see. It was thick, filled with papers that looked eerily familiar. Medical records, reports, documents. And then she said the one thing that made the entire audience gasp again. Mrs. Anderson, we've been expecting you. Silence. Total, deafening silence. And in that moment, everything changed. A cold stillness gripped the studio. The weight of Melania's words had shattered the manufactured drama that the host had so carefully crafted. Mrs. Anderson, we've been expecting you. The audience gasped, their collective breath hitching as their eyes darted between Melania Trump and the woman in the back row, Mrs. Anderson, who now stood frozen in disbelief. The host's face paled. This was not how this was supposed to go. His plan had been simple: corner Melania with an explosive question, watch her squirm, and let the headlines write themselves. But now, as papers littered the studio floor, as a mother trembled before them, as Melania Trump stood unshaken, prepared, and in complete control, it was clear he had lost. Still, the host wasn't ready to surrender. Forcing a strained chuckle, he tried to deflect. Well, Mrs. Trump, that's quite the dramatic response, but surely we can all agree. Melania raised a single hand, her movement slow but commanding, and the host's words died in his throat. She turned her gaze toward Mrs. Anderson, her expression one of quiet empathy. Please, she said softly, ignoring the host completely. Sit down. You don't have to stand alone anymore. The words broke something inside Mrs. Anderson. With choked sob, she collapsed back into her chair, hands trembling as she tried to gather the scattered medical bills at her feet. Her burdens, her struggles, exposed to the world. Melania moved to her side, kneeling beside her, not as a political figure, not as the former First Lady, but as a mother understanding another mother's pain. Mrs. Anderson, she said gently, her voice carrying a strength that filled the room. You don't need to explain anymore. We already know. The audience leaned forward, hanging on her every word. The host shifted uncomfortably, realizing he was no longer the one in control. 3 months ago, when your question was first submitted, Melania continued, her tone steady yet warm, we did something different than what some people hoped we would do. Her eyes flickered briefly to the host, a silent but devastating call-out. Instead of dismissing it, instead of turning it into a spectacle, we asked ourselves, why would a mother ask this? She held up the file in her hands. The same file she had pulled out just moments ago. And that's when we found you. Mrs. Anderson's lips trembled. The host looked desperate now, his grip on his cue cards tightening. This was his worst nightmare, his attempted scandal morphing into a moment of genuine, undeniable humanity. Melania stood, turned, and addressed the entire studio. Mrs. Anderson's son, Tommy, has been through 17 specialists in 3 states. The medical bills now total $147,800. She's sold her car, she works 3 jobs, and yet, she paused, her voice unwavering, she has received no answers. The audience gasped again, the reality hitting them like a gut punch. Melania took a slow step toward the host. And yet, you chose to turn her plea into a game. A dangerous silence fell over the studio. The host swallowed, a flicker of panic flashing across his face. This wasn't supposed to be about real people. It was supposed to be a soundbite, a trap, an easy headline. But Melania had outmaneuvered him completely. "Mrs. Anderson didn't ask about Baron to insult me," she continued, her gaze piercing through the man sitting across from her. She was hoping, desperately hoping, that someone out there might understand her fear. She turned back to Mrs. Anderson, her voice gentler now. "And we do." Mrs. Anderson broke down in quiet sobs, clutching her folder as if it were her last connection to hope itself. And then Melania delivered the final blow, the moment that would turn this story into something the host would never recover from. "Mrs. Anderson, you are not alone. You never were." The camera zoomed in as she handed over the file in her hands. It looked exactly like the medical records Mrs. Anderson had been carrying, except this one had Trump Foundation letterhead on the front. "Because we already took care of everything." A stunned gasp erupted from the audience. Mrs. Anderson's eyes widened in disbelief. "What?" she stammered. Melania smiled softly. "Your son's tests have been scheduled. The best specialists in the country will see him next week. And every single medical bill, they've already been paid." A wave of emotion crashed over the studio. Tears. Applause. Shock. And the host? His career-ending mistake now etched into history. He had wanted a scandal. Instead, he had just witnessed a miracle. The studio hung in stunned silence. Every pair of eyes in the room was locked on the scene unfolding before them. Melania Trump stood victorious, her elegant posture commanding the room, while Mrs. Anderson sat frozen, staring at the thick file in her trembling hands. The host, the once smirking media manipulator, sat rigid in his chair. He had lost complete control, but he wasn't ready to go down without a fight. With a forced laugh, he straightened his tie, scrambling for a way to spin this back in his favor. "Well now," he said, his voice carrying a thin layer of forced amusement, "this certainly is an unexpected turn of events." The audience wasn't buying it. Melania Trump, without even looking at him, continued speaking directly to Mrs. Anderson, her tone filled with genuine warmth. "Your son's journey doesn't end here," she assured her. "We've also identified 30 other families facing similar challenges. The Trump Foundation has set up a dedicated fund to make sure no mother has to fight alone, ever again." Mrs. Anderson's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. She had come looking for hope, and now she had found it. The audience broke into murmurs of admiration, a few even wiping away tears. But the host, he could feel the narrative slipping further and further away. His eyes darted toward the control booth, where his producer was frantically gesturing, likely trying to figure out whether to cut to commercial or let this disaster play out. No, he refused to let this be his downfall. Clearing his throat, he leaned forward and forced a smirk onto his face. "Well, Mrs. Trump," he said, trying to reassert himself, "I must say, this is all very touching. Almost hard to believe, really." Melania didn't even flinch. "You mean to say," he continued, his words dripping with manufactured suspicion, "that all of this was set in motion from a single question? That the Trump Foundation just so happened to be investigating this for months? Forgive me, but isn't that a little convenient?" The audience bristled at the veiled accusation. Mrs. Anderson's brows furrowed in confusion, her relief momentarily overshadowed by the host's attempt to twist the moment into another political game. But Melania? She simply tilted her head slightly, her soft smile never faltering. And then she delivered the words that would seal the host's fate forever. "You see, this is the difference between us," she said, her voice calm but piercing. "When a mother asks for help, you see an opportunity to create controversy. I see an opportunity to actually help." The entire room went still. The host's face twitched slightly, his grip tightening around his cue cards. Melania wasn't finished. Do you want to know why we knew about Mrs. Anderson? Why we took action? She continued, stepping forward. Because unlike you, we don't wait for cameras to roll before we do what's right. A wave of applause rippled through the audience. The host's smirk faded completely. Melania, undeterred, turned back to Mrs. Anderson and gently took her hands. Tommy's treatment is just the beginning. You don't owe us anything, Mrs. Anderson. We are simply doing what should have been done all along. Mrs. Anderson sobbed openly now, clutching Melania's hands as if they were her lifeline. The cameras zoomed in on the raw emotion, capturing a moment of genuine humanity, something the host had never expected. And then came the final blow. Melania turned her attention back to the host, her expression cool and composed. Now, she said, her tone shifting slightly, you seemed so eager to discuss DNA testing. Let's go back to that, shall we? The color drained from his face. Melania continued, her words cutting like a blade. You spent the last 30 minutes trying to use my son as a weapon. You implied doubt where there was none. You tried to stir scandal, not because you had facts, but because you had an agenda. The audience watched in awe. But now we see the truth, Melania added. This was never about Baron. It was about you trying to boost your ratings at the expense of a child. A low murmur spread through the crowd, disgust shimmering in their eyes. The host had nowhere left to run. Sweat beaded at his temples as he realized just how catastrophic this moment was for him. His plan to trap Melania had turned into a career-ending disaster. And then, as if fate hadn't punished him enough, a voice rang out from the studio's corner. She's right. The audience turned sharply. A woman stood up from the second row, her face etched with determination. The Trump family helped my daughter too. No cameras, no press, just help when we needed it most. The room erupted with whispers as more voices joined in. Paid my brother's medical bills, one man called out. They helped our veteran family when we lost our home. We never told anyone because they never asked for publicity. The host was sinking fast, his carefully constructed illusion collapsing around him. Everything he had worked toward, his credibility, his influence, his reputation, was disintegrating before his very eyes. This was no longer about scandal. This was about truth. And the truth had just set fire to his career. As the applause swelled and Mrs. Anderson clutched her lifeline of hope, the host stared blankly ahead, his once smug expression replaced by pure, unfiltered defeat. Melania turned back to Mrs. Anderson, her mission complete, her dignity intact. Shall we get Tommy the help he deserves? She asked kindly. Mrs. Anderson nodded, her tears finally drying. And in that moment, it was over. For the host, this would be the night his career died. For Mrs. Anderson, this would be the night her faith in humanity was restored. And for Melania Trump, this would be the night she reminded the world that real leadership isn't about winning debates, it's about changing lives. The air in the studio was electric, a rare moment of truth had just unfolded, and the audience knew it. Melania Trump had turned the tables flawlessly, exposing the host's true intentions while uplifting the very people he had sought to exploit. But he wasn't done yet. As the applause slowly faded, the host forced himself to sit up straighter in his chair, masking the panic rising in his chest. He had just been humiliated on national television, and if he didn't find a way to redirect the narrative, fast, this would be the moment that defined his career's downfall. He reached for his cue cards, shuffling through them as if he still had control. With a thin smile that barely concealed his frustration, he cleared his throat. Well, Mrs. Trump, he began, his voice strained but carefully measured, I must say, that was quite the response. I'm sure our viewers at home weren't expecting that. Melania remained standing, her gaze unwavering, her expression composed. I imagine they weren't expecting you to use a struggling mother's plea as political bait either, she replied smoothly, her words landing like a punch. The audience stirred, they saw what was happening. The host faltered for just a second but pressed on, determined to wrestle control back. But let's not forget, he continued, his tone taking on a forced neutrality. This all started with a simple question, a question many Americans have wondered about. And while it's wonderful that you're helping Mrs. Anderson, It still doesn't answer the bigger issue, does it? Melania tilted her head slightly, sensing the trap he was trying to set. "And what issue is that?" she asked, her voice cool. The host leaned in, grasping at straws. "Transparency, Mrs. Trump?" The audience tensed. They saw exactly where this was going. "There have always been rumors surrounding Baron Trump," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "His rapid growth, his reserved nature. Some have speculated for years whether the full story has ever been told." A ripple of discomfort ran through the audience. The host was taking a risk, and he knew it. He had just insinuated something dangerous, that there was still some hidden truth about Baron that the public wasn't being told. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, murmurs. A woman in the front row shook her head in disbelief. Mrs. Anderson, still clutching her medical documents, looked horrified. She now realized that her son's struggle had been twisted into a weapon. Melania took a slow, measured breath. "And then," she laughed, a soft, knowing laugh that sent a wave of unease through the host. "Is that really what you're trying now?" she said, shaking her head. Her eyes burned with a quiet fire, but her voice remained steady. "You're suggesting that because my son is different, because he does not fit into a prepackaged mold, there must be some great secret?" The host didn't answer. "Because he didn't have one." "How disappointing," Melina added, her voice cutting like a blade. "You could have used this moment to actually talk about real issues, like why families like Mrs. Anderson struggle to afford health care, but instead, you're still desperately clinging to your tired, baseless insinuations." The audience erupted into applause. The host's face burned red. He could feel the sweat on the back of his neck, could hear the producers in his earpiece scrambling for an out. This was getting worse by the second. Desperate, he leaned forward, forcing another tight-lipped smile. "I think our viewers simply want clarity," he said, grasping for control. "Surely you can understand why people have questions." Melania nodded, but not for the reason he hoped. "Yes, I understand," she said smoothly. And then she did the unexpected. She turned to the audience, her voice gentle yet unshakable. "Let me ask all of you," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "How many of you have ever had a child who struggled? A child who was different from others? A child who grew too fast, spoke too little, or simply didn't fit into the box the world wanted to place them in?" Hands rose across the studio. Parents nodded solemnly. A woman in the third row wiped her eyes. Melania turned back to the host, her expression calm but resolute. "And tell me," she continued, "why should a mother have to justify her child's existence to a media that only seeks to sensationalize it?" The host's mouth fell open slightly. Melania took one step closer, her final words sealing his fate. "My son is healthy. He is strong. He is kind. And he is nobody's headline." The studio burst into thunderous applause. The host leaned back in his chair, his confidence shattered. He had spent the entire segment trying to force a scandal. And instead, Melania had just delivered one of the most powerful moments in live television history. The narrative had changed. Not about Baron, not about Melania, but about every mother who had ever fought to protect her child from a world that judged too quickly and listened too slowly. And the host? He was left speechless, because the moment he had waited for, the scandal, the controversy, the viral takedown, was never going to come. And now, his career was on borrowed time. The weight of the moment hung thick in the studio air. Melania Trump had just delivered one of the most powerful rebuttals ever seen on live television, and the audience knew it. Even the producers behind the cameras were frozen, uncertain of whether to cut to commercial or let this moment play out in real time. The host, however, was far from finished. Humiliated, cornered, stripped of the power he thought he held, he wasn't going to let this moment slip away without a fight. For a second, his eyes darted to his producer's booth, where frantic hand signals begged him to steer the segment back to neutral ground. But his pride wouldn't allow it. He leaned forward, his knuckles gripping the edge of his desk, his smile returning. Not as confidence, but as sheer desperation. Mrs. Trump, he said, his voice lower now, I have to ask, are you really suggesting that there has never been a single question, he paused dramatically, his tone dripping with innuendo, about Baron Trump's true parentage? The studio gasped. There it was, the final nuclear option. The host had nothing left to lose, so he went for the dirtiest move in the book. A blatant, unfounded paternity question meant to shake Melania's composure and drag this into the scandal he had been hoping for all along. The air in the room went ice cold. Melania stilled, but she did not blink. The audience's murmurs grew louder, their discomfort turning into outrage. Even some of the host's own crew exchanged stunned looks. They had seen ruthless journalism before, but this was purely calculated cruelty. But the real mistake was thinking that Melania Trump, one of the most composed and scrutinized women in modern history, would crumble under pressure. Instead, she smiled, a slow, knowing smile, and the host's confidence withered instantly. You poor, desperate man, Melania said softly, shaking her head. The audience burst into gasps, followed by a thunderous applause. The host's face turned ghostly pale. Melania took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and when she spoke again, her voice was calm but lethal. You see, I was right about you from the start, she continued. This was never about a real discussion. It was never about public curiosity or transparency. You wanted a spectacle, a scandal, and when you didn't get it, you did the only thing you knew how to do. She tilted her head slightly. You attacked a child. The host flinched. The audience roared in agreement. People were on their feet now, clapping, some even booing the host outright. But Melania wasn't finished yet. She reached into the folder she had brought with her and pulled out a document, unfolding it slowly. Since you are so very interested in Baron's medical history, she said, perhaps you'd like to read this. She held the paper out toward the host, her expression unreadable. The host hesitated. The camera zoomed in on the bold title at the top of the page. Official Medical Genetic Report. Baron Trump. The audience stared in stunned silence as the host swallowed hard, realizing what was happening. Melania had anticipated this exact attack, and she had come prepared. Go on, she urged, her voice mockingly gentle. You wanted answers, didn't you? The host hesitated again, because he knew if he took that paper he would have to read out loud the undeniable truth, that every vile rumor, every insinuation, every disgusting whisper of paternity doubts was absolute nonsense. But he couldn't back down now, not after how far he had gone. So, with a shaking hand, he took the paper and read. The report was simple but powerful. It confirmed beyond any doubt that Baron was biologically his father's son. Nothing was left to question. No scandal, no controversy, just facts. The audience erupted, some laughing at the host's sheer failure, others cheering for Melania's grace under fire. The host set the paper down shakily, his face drained of all confidence. Melania leaned forward slightly, her voice just above a whisper, but filled with the kind of power that couldn't be ignored. You didn't want answers, she said. You wanted a headline. The studio fell deathly silent. But you see, there is no headline, she continued. Just another failed attempt to attack a family that has already endured more than enough. The host had nothing left to say. The studio cameras stayed locked on him, exposed, defeated, and ashamed. Melania then turned to the audience, delivering the final blow. I do not need to defend my son. I do not need to justify my family. And I certainly do not need to stand here and entertain these ridiculous games. The audience roared in approval, their cheers drowning out the host's humiliation. Melania turned away, adjusted her blazer, and with the effortless grace of a woman who had just won the greatest debate of her life, she walked off the set. And as she left, the entire studio knew. This was no longer the host's show. It was Melania's victory. The aftermath of the live interview was unlike anything the network had ever seen. Within minutes of the segment airing, social media erupted in a firestorm of reactions. and the host's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. What was supposed to be his career-defining moment had turned into a spectacular failure, exposing him not as a journalist, but as a desperate entertainer willing to exploit a child for ratings. But for Melania Trump, it was a masterclass in grace, composure, and quiet strength. As the cameras cut to commercial, the studio remained dead silent. The audience sat frozen, barely able to process what had just happened. Some people exchanged glances, while others nervously checked their phones, already seeing the headlines explode in real time. The host, still seated behind his desk, was ghostly pale, his fingers tightening around his cue cards, as if holding onto them could somehow salvage what was left of his dignity. But there was nothing left to salvage. The moment Melania had walked off the set, she had already won. One of the producers rushed onto the stage, whispering something frantically into the host's earpiece. His eyes widened, his breath shallowing as he realized the depth of his mistake. "Sir," the producer murmured urgently, keeping his voice low so the audience couldn't hear. "The network is calling. He hesitated, swallowing hard. "They're furious." The host's stomach twisted. He was supposed to be celebrated after this. He had dreamed of the headlines, the media praise, the viral clips of his fearless journalism. Instead, the headlines were brutal. Talk show host's career implodes after disgusting attack on Baron Trump. Melania Trump shuts down host in one sentence. Watch the moment that left him speechless. TV host's desperate ploy to humiliate the Trumps backfires in the most spectacular way possible. He tried to compose himself, forcing a weak smile as the cameras returned from commercial. "Well," he muttered awkwardly into the microphone, "that certainly was something." No one laughed. The audience, who had once come in excited to watch a high-stakes interview, now looked at him differently, with disgust, with disappointment. This was not entertainment. This was an attempted character assassination on a mother and her child, and it had just backfired on live television. And it wasn't just the audience who had turned against him. At that very moment, inside the network's corporate offices, executives were in damage control mode. The backlash was growing by the second, and their phones were ringing off the hook with furious viewers, disgusted sponsors, and even legal teams questioning if Melania Trump had grounds to sue. "Get him off the air," one of the network heads barked into the phone, staring at the social media disaster unfolding in real time. "Now!" Meanwhile, Melania's departure from the studio was just as composed as her interview performance. She walked gracefully through the backstage corridors, her assistants and security following close behind. A young production assistant, no older than 23, hesitantly stepped forward, her eyes wide with admiration. "Mrs. Trump," she blurted out, I just wanted to say, that was incredible." Melania paused, offering the young woman a small but genuine smile. "Thank you," she said simply, placing a reassuring hand on the assistant's shoulder before continuing toward the exit. Her presence alone had shifted the energy of the entire studio. No matter how the media had tried to portray her in the past, tonight was undeniable. She had been attacked, demeaned, and targeted, but she had walked away stronger, untouched, victorious. By the time she reached her car, her phone buzzed with messages from allies and supporters. Donald Trump himself had watched the segment from afar. He had known, of course, that they would try to weaponize the media against his family. Again. But this time, they had picked the wrong battle. A message from Trump flashed across Melania's phone screen. "You just did what most politicians can't. You handled a snake and made him look like a fool, without breaking a sweat. Amazing job, Melania." She chuckled softly, shaking her head. There was no need for victory laps. No need for follow-up interviews or press statements. The moment had spoken for itself. Meanwhile, inside the network headquarters, the host was being pulled into an emergency meeting with the executives. His hands were clammy, his breath shallow. As he stepped into the boardroom, he already knew what was coming. The head of the network, an older man in a crisp navy suit, didn't waste time with pleasantries. He leaned forward, his expression grim and unforgiving. "You done?" The host's stomach dropped. "Wait, what? No, this isn't..." "We told you to push the conversation," the executive snapped, "not commit career suicide on live television." "I can fix this." "No, you can't," the executive interrupted. "You lost the audience. You lost every audience. And worse, you handed the Trumps one of their biggest wins in media history." The host opened his mouth to argue, but what was left to say? His own arrogance had destroyed him. And Melania Trump? She had walked away unscathed, untouchable, and more respected than ever before. His career was over. But hers? She had just cemented her legacy in a way no one could have predicted. The fallout from the disastrous interview was immediate, brutal, and unrelenting. What was meant to be a career-making ambush had turned into a national reckoning, not just for the failed host, but for an entire media machine that had, for years, sought to destroy the Trumps through smear tactics and fabricated controversies. The public had spoken, and they were not on the media's side this time. Within hours, major news outlets were forced to report on what had happened, struggling to contain the wildfire that had erupted online. Melania Trump destroys host in unforgettable takedown. Watch her unshakable response. Media attempt to smear Baron Trump backfires spectacularly. Host faces unprecedented backlash. The moment Melania Trump silenced the media with one line, the host's own network executives panicked, trying to distance themselves from the train wreck. Sponsors began pulling ads, longtime viewers threatened boycotts, and industry insiders whispered about imminent consequences. Meanwhile, Melania Trump's grace under fire had cemented her legacy in a way no one could have anticipated. She hadn't just defended her son, she had exposed an entire system built on deception and manipulation. And the people noticed. Across social media, the conversation had shifted from political divides to something deeper: the ethics of media, the weaponization of journalism, and the line between scrutiny and exploitation. One tweet summed it up perfectly. That wasn't an interview, that was an attempted ambush on a mother and her child, and Melania Trump walked through it like a queen. Absolutely disgraceful, on the host's part. The support for Melania grew exponentially, with figures across the political spectrum, even some previous critics, publicly condemning the host's tactics. Among them, high-profile journalists, media watchdogs, and even Hollywood figures who, despite their personal politics, couldn't ignore the sheer nastiness of the attack. Even those who had once mocked or dismissed her now had to acknowledge her strength. And as for the host, his downfall was swift and absolute. The network suspended him indefinitely. His sponsors abandoned him overnight. His credibility shattered beyond repair. By morning, a former colleague leaked an internal memo from the network confirming what everyone suspected. "We do not support the direction taken in last night's interview. Effective immediately, hosts will not be returning to the program." He was done. The same arrogance and cruelty that had once made him a liberal media favorite had now made him radioactive. And Melania? She never had to say another word about it. Her actions, her grace, and her quiet but powerful defense of her family had said everything that needed to be said. And then, just when people thought the story was over, Melania Trump did something that no one expected. Rather than simply enjoying the victory, Melania seized the moment to do something greater. She announced a new initiative, one dedicated to assisting families struggling with medical expenses, particularly those dealing with rare genetic conditions, like Mrs. Anderson's son, Tommy. The announcement came in the most understated yet powerful way possible. On her personal social media, she posted a simple message. When a mother speaks, she should be heard. When a child suffers, they should be helped. This is not about politics. It is about doing what is right. That is why I am proud to announce the expansion of our efforts to support families in need. Be best. Alongside it was a link to a newly launched foundation backed by private donors, medical professionals, and non-profit organizations. And just like that, what was meant to be a media attack had transformed into a movement of genuine change. Donations poured in. Families shared their stories. Medical experts pledged their support. It was a devastatingly poetic turn of events. The host had tried to destroy a family for ratings, and instead, that same family had used the moment to help thousands of others. And the final blow? The show that once prided itself on being a liberal media powerhouse never recovered from the scandal. Ratings plummeted. Trust was gone. And the host? Disgraced, forgotten, irrelevant. The irony was undeniable. The media had spent years trying to paint the Trump family as villains, but time and time again, they proved themselves to be something entirely different. Because when faced with cruelty, they responded with compassion. When faced with hatred, they answered with action. And when faced with cheap political attacks, they walked away unscathed, stronger than ever. Months later, Melania Trump was asked about the interview in a rare sit-down discussion. The interviewer, a well-respected journalist, posed the question carefully. "Mrs. Trump, looking back at that infamous moment, how do you feel about what happened?" Melania smiled softly, pausing for a moment before answering. "I feel grateful," she said simply. The interviewer raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Grateful?" "Yes, because sometimes when people try to hurt you, they actually give you the greatest opportunity to do good." She gestured toward a framed photo beside her, a picture of her and Barron, standing beside Tommy and his mother at the new foundation headquarters. They wanted to create a scandal. Instead, we created something real, and that is always the better choice. The interview ended on that note, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with the quiet strength of a woman who knew exactly who she was. And as the screen faded to black, one thing was clear. Melania Trump had won, not just the battle, but the war. This story is more than just a confrontation. It's a lesson in dignity, resilience, and truth. In a world where the media often prioritizes sensationalism over sincerity, Melania Trump's grace and unwavering strength turned an attack into an opportunity for change. She reminded us that real leadership isn't about tearing others down, it's about lifting people up. Her response wasn't just about defending her family. It was about showing the power of character in the face of cruelty. And in doing so, she didn't just silence her critics, she inspired a movement. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Let's continue to highlight stories of courage, integrity, and standing up for what's right. Together, we can ensure that truth always rises above the noise.